Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was swarmed by around 100 protesters at an event in Belleville, Ontario. Lethbridge police don't suspect foul play involving a man whose body was found at a Westside McDonald's last week. And a popular crooner passes away in New York. We hear more about the life of the legendary Tony Bennett.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, it appears as though a second tentative deal has been reached with BC dock workers. The union says it will be meeting next week to recommend the terms of a tentative agreement to its membership, then a vote will be held. The International Longshore and Warehouse Union Canada said the latest round of bargaining resulted in the new tentative agreement with the BC Maritime Employers Association. The wild week began on Tuesday when the union said no to a proposed settlement and the workers walked. Wednesday, the workers stood down after the federal government ruled the resumed action illegal due to a lack of 72-hour strike notice. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he's glad to see the union reconsidering the good offer that is currently on the table. More needs to be done to improve Canada's supply chain and advancing interprovincial trade. Those were some of the comments made as Canada's Agriculture Minister met with her provincial and territorial counterparts in Fredericton, New Brunswick earlier today.
The co-chairs of the Industry Committee gave us a progress report on the Grocery Code of Conduct, which aims to improve relations between all parties of the Canadian food supply chain. The ministers offered support for the industry's proposed solutions, including a commitment to fund the initial creation of a Grocery Code Adjudication Office. We are now calling for broad industry participation in this voluntary code, especially among food retailers, and will be keeping a close eye on its implementation. We also discussed interprovincial trade. With the collaboration of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, we are working on pilot projects so that slaughterhouses located near a neighboring province can slaughter and process livestock from farmers on the other side of the border.
Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, meanwhile, was in Aspen, Colorado. She's taking part of the 14th Annual Aspen Security Forum. It's a venue for global leaders to talk about national security issues and foreign policy. Freeland says when it comes to foreign policy, there always needs to be a focus on Beijing.
We are very aware of, very focused on China in the world, and very focused both on Canada's position as a country vis-a-vis China, but also our collaboration with allies. And intelligence and security is a big part of it. I think a real opportunity and a place where Canada has an outsized role to play is in securing supply chains, particularly in critical minerals and metals. And this is something that we are investing in aggressively.
Following a year-long investigation, the RCMP has charged a retired police officer with foreign interference. 60-year-old William Meiker is accused of helping the Chinese government identify and intimidate a person. He's facing charges of conspiracy and preparatory acts for the benefit of a foreign entity. Police say Meiker is from Hong Kong and allege he used his network of Canadian contacts to get intelligence or services that benefited the Chinese government. Around 100 protesters converged on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Belleville, Ontario yesterday. Many were yelling and screaming at the Prime Minister about the high cost of living and demanding that he step down. Some were overheard yelling the word traitor. Trudeau was in Belleville to mark the 7th anniversary of the Liberal government's childcare benefit. He was to meet with the city's mayor, plus visit the farmers market, but instead, he and his security detail were confronted by a number of angry Canadians as he made his way back to his motorcade. Collaboration and partnerships between provinces are crucial for Canada's success. Now, that's according to Josh Andrus, the Executive Director of Project Confederation. He says the decisions made in Ottawa are not always in the province's best interests. He says there's a need for provincial leaders to unite and fight back when the time is right.
We've seen provinces push back. We've seen provinces push back Like right now, we're seeing it with in the Maritimes, for example. Atlantic Canada is standing up to the climate agenda because, again, it is about their ability to raise revenues internally. It is about their ability to provide good economic conditions for investors and job creators so that they can build the economy. We're seeing BC start to push back against certain areas in healthcare, right? Ontario has almost liberalized the use of the notwithstanding clause against the Prime Minister's wishes.
Andrus will also explain why he believes the recent Sustainable Jobs Bill, or Just Transition Act, is poorly planned. He'll share details in an interview with BCN's Naveen Day coming up after Business News. Well, it was another scorcher in many parts of southwestern Alberta once again today. Jeanette Rocher is in now with an early peek at the forecast. Jeanette, Environment Canada issued another heat warning for our region, and it doesn't look like things will be cooling off anytime soon.
No, they won't be. Highs of 34 and 35 is what we're looking at all weekend long. And despite the chance of some slight showers this evening and the possibility of a thunderstorm, we're looking at relatively dry conditions with much lower humidity than they're seeing in other parts of the country along with this heat. So, you know, it's like, as they say in the desert, it's a dry heat. The same thing goes for here in southern Alberta. And that heat warning should remain in effect through next week. And I will be back later in the show to give you all those details along with the national forecast.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeanette. With the current forecasted high temperatures in our city, there's now a fire ban in effect for the River Valley in Lethbridge. Fire officials implemented the ban primarily because of the low humidity, gusting winds, and sweltering long-range forecast.
With the continued hot, dry weather, we can see that the coulees and the river bottom, the fuels and grasses have been drying out. And with the forecasted temperatures that we're going to be seeing this weekend, along with the low humidity and winds, it's going to elevate the fire risk into extreme. So we're doing this definitely as a precaution for now. And there's very little precipitation, if any, in the forecast coming up. So conditions will continue to be hot and dry.
With a heat warning issued for Lethbridge, the city has moved into level 2 of their extreme temperature response protocol.
We are going to see some high temperatures this weekend, but they are going to start decreasing again once we get to the new week and Monday. So it will be a touch and go, but the biggest thing is just creating accesses for the community in terms of resourcing. One of the big things we want to highlight today is just new in the city are the potable water stations that are attached to fire hydrants. So again, if you're in the downtown core or in some of our parks where those exist, we encourage people to take opportunity of those, stay hydrated, of course wearing light colored and lightweight clothing while you're out there, and avoiding peak times of 12 till noon.
Officials say if you're trying to beat the heat, the city recommends taking advantage of some of the cooler areas around the city, including the mall or the libraries, which are air conditioned. 3 people have been arrested and more than $100,000 worth of drugs and guns were seized following a drug bust here in Lethbridge. Alert raided a total of 4 houses, including one in Legacy Ridge in the north that was known as a drug home, and found 648 grams worth of cocaine, 619 grams of methamphetamine, 2,800 illicit cigarettes, a shotgun, ammunition, and around $10,800 in cash. 37-year-old Nicholas Galbraith, 31-year-old Greg Rediguer, and 27-year-old Hope Progue face various charges, including drug possession and drug trafficking. Police say they began their investigation in November of last year. Now here's a follow-up to a story we first brought you last week. Lethbridge police say the investigation into a body that was located at a Lethbridge McDonald's has shown no evidence that foul play was involved. On July 14th, police got a call from staff at the restaurant along University Drive that a body was found inside of a storage shed. The shed was previously damaged by a fire on July 3rd. The identity of the man will not be released, and staff with the LPS say no further information will be provided. RCMP in Redcliffe, Alberta need help identifying a man who was found dead on July 18th. Police say the man had no identification on him. He was wearing a gray hoodie, gray pants, hiking boots, and a watch on his wrist. A red and black hockey bag was found near him, which contained various items including work gloves, glasses, a Tilly hat, a switchblade, and a hunting knife. If you know who the man is, you're asked to call Crime Stoppers right away at 1-800-222-8477. The emergency department at the Pincher Creek Health Centre will be closed overnight on Saturday and Sunday. Alberta Health Services says it's due to a lack of physicians. Officials say it will reopen to 24-hour service Monday morning at 7:30. During the temporary closure, nursing staff will remain on site to provide care for inpatients, and doctor support will be available by phone. While the emergency department is closed in Pincher Creek, AHS says to call 911 in case of an emergency. For patient care, they're saying to visit other facilities in southwestern Alberta, including the health centres in Cardston, the Crow's Nest Pass, and Fort Macleod. Also the Chinook Regional Hospital here in Lethbridge. The 2023 Alberta Summer Games are underway with over 3,800 youth athletes, coaches, and managers coming together from across the province to compete. A delegation from Lethbridge has also been sent to compete at the Games taking place in Okotoks and Black Diamond until July 23rd. Video journalist Micah Quinn has the details on the first Games to be held since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic.
On Thursday evening, the opening ceremonies for the 2023 Alberta Summer Games helped kick off the first event since 2018.
So there's everything happening from athletics, which is race, running, and high jumping, and so on. Triathlon, biathlon, duathlon, canoeing, kayaking. So we're really excited here in town, and it's going to be good for our economic value of the whole district. We've had 1,500 people step up to be volunteers. We had to actually close it down yesterday. We had so many people wanting to volunteer, so that's wonderful. Says a lot for the area.
Meanwhile, here in Lethbridge, a large number of athletes were sent from our region to compete in the Games.
The Lethbridge delegation, which we included Coledale and Colehurst in our list of Lethbridge. Lots of the athletes from Coledale and Colehurst train, with Lethbridge facilities and that sort of thing. So we have included them. So there is approximately 100 participants from the Lethbridge region who are going. And Zone 1 is made up of approximately 273 athletes altogether. And so Lethbridge has 100 of them, which, over a third. So we think that's a fantastic showing.
For more information on the event, you can visit albertasummergames.ca. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
Hope the Lethbridge athletes will do very well. The Shoes for Kids YQL organization is back for their third annual event. The group is now partnering with Lethbridge Family Services to help get brand new shoes to those in need across southern Alberta. The goal this year is to collect 350 pairs of footwear. Mallory Christiansen, the president of Shoes for Kids YQL, offered an update as to how much in donations have been collected so far.
Right now, we're at over $14,000 for monetary donations for Shoes for Kids with a goal of $20,000. We are so thankful for the community who has already stepped up, not only with financial donations, but also opening their door to be drop-off venues, right? We are still in need of $6,000 so that we can reach our goal of $20,000 this year. And with the support of our community, we are very optimistic that we're going to get there.
Vic Rizal, the manager of youth services with Lethbridge Family Services, says it's been amazing to join forces with Shoes for Kids YQL.
The whole ball game is totally different when you have a good kicks on your feet. It really motivates them to also go to school. So I'm really amazed. I'm really grateful, thankful to YQL initiative and also to the whole community who are putting in a lot of effort to donate shoes, donate money, anything it is, in order to provide a better way, better things for the kids to be able to access the whole community program and also education.
Now, a special event will be held by the Shoes for Kids group. Mark this down on the calendar. It's August 19th from 10 till noon in the parking lot of Dunlop Ford in Lethbridge for new footwear donations. More information on the event or drop-off locations, make sure to visit their Facebook page. Locals are invited to take part in the grand renaming event tomorrow for the Wade Galloway Skate Park here in the city. The special day includes a free barbecue for the first 200 people, along with a Borderline skate shop providing skate demos. Wade Galloway sadly passed away suddenly in February of 2014, but it was his work in the community which inspired him to run and win a seat at Lethbridge City Council.
So when that accident happened, it was a real tough one. It was very soon, obviously, after the election that we were both elected. But to be able to see this happen, something that he pushed so hard to have that particular facility and that park in our community, and to see it there and everybody enjoy that park, to have his name as part to it is just, it's really heartwarming, to be very honest. So I'm excited to be there on Saturday to be able to take part in that announcement.
The event starts at 11:30 a.m. tomorrow at the corner of Mayor McGrath and Parkside Drive South. With Canada's inflation rate dipping slightly to 2.8%, officials at Nikiyuko Japanese Gardens say they've been seeing lots of visitors at the park. Eric Granson, the marketing manager for Nikiyuko, says their numbers have been great, especially since the beginning of the summer.
During May, we had a huge turnout, and last month in June, we had 6,200 people, which last year in June, we had 5,000. So we're already 1,200 above where we were last month, and we're just constantly seeing new people and new faces, which has been great, and people visiting from other towns, which has been fantastic. Honestly, everywhere from, I've had people from Holland, all the way in Europe, all the way down to the United States, down in Florida, Texas. It's been crazy. People have been coming in to see this wonderful, beautiful place.
Yeah, it certainly is beautiful. The Garden Summer Campaign will continue until early October. Conserving land for future generations is vital. Now, that's according to Justin Thompson, Executive Director with the Southern Alberta Land Trust Society. Mr. Thompson says the Porcupine Hills and the Alberta Foothills is a large piece of grassland that needs to be protected to preserve our watershed and wildlife.
But west of Highway 2, all along the Porcupine Hills, that is actually to the west of Highway 2 on the east side of the Porcupine Hills. That is one of the biggest remaining blocks of grassland in southern Alberta. It's one of those places that has not been converted to other land uses. And so that's a really important area for us to try and see, both from a wildlife standpoint, but also from a watershed, right? Because so many of our creeks and rivers flow off those foothills. And so keeping those foothills intact is really key.
And make sure you catch the full interview with Justin Thompson from SALT and BCN's Jeanette Rocher coming up after Business News. Greenhouses in northern Canada are providing space for communities to grow their own produce. They say it really helps promote self-sufficiency and creates jobs. Many remote communities are reliant on food that is flown in, processed, and expensive with limited access to fresh fruit and veggies.
I think it gives more autonomy over what you can produce yourself, and then also, I guess, it does put it down in the weekly grocery store list too. But we honestly do this to mostly provide that space of autonomy, the education, and allowing people to learn about how to grow from home. And then we do planter bed workshops too, so people can bring planter boxes full of soil home so they can plant from home too. So it's trying to increase that autonomy of, you can grow stuff on your own at home, but in terms of putting a dent in food security, it's more like showing people what you can do.
Legendary crooner Tony Bennett has died. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's back in 2016, but continued to perform up until 2021. Bennett is best known for his big hit in 1962, I Left My Heart in San Francisco. Frank Sinatra once referred to Bennett as the greatest popular singer in the world. Bennett began his recording career back in 1949, and in 1994, at the age of 67, he won a Grammy Award for Album of the Year. In total, he won 18 Grammy Awards. Anthony Dominic Benedetto passed away in New York at the age of 96. Another heat warning was issued for Lethbridge earlier today. It was sunny and hot. Jeanette Rocher is now with a full look at the weather picture. Jeanette, a beautiful weekend is shaping up, and maybe a good time to hop into the lake for a swim, or maybe soak in one of those little kiddie pools.
Yeah, this week you're all about the kiddie pools and running through the sprinklers. Anything the kids do to keep cool, I like it. Maybe grab a popsicle while you're at it. But definitely staying cool is going to be the theme this week with this heat warning in effect into early part of next week. They're looking at 35s and 34s for daytime highs throughout the weekend into Monday as well. And that also means teen temperatures overnight. So we're not getting a lot of reprieve in the evening. So definitely think about perhaps shifting those plans, outdoor plans to indoor plans, if you are prone to heat stroke. So definitely watch yourself for the heat stroke. We're looking at mainly clear skies all throughout the week, not getting back into the 20s until midweek. We're looking at 29 on Wednesday and a high of 27 on Thursday. And that's basically the low for the week. Average high for this time of year, though, 26. Average low, 11 degrees, 36. That was our high temperature on this day back in 1945. So not quite a record breaker today. The low temperature on this day happened back in 1953, and it was 6 degrees. Sun rose this morning at 5:47, sunset this evening at 9:28. So we are under 16 hours of daylight, 15 hours and 41 minutes actually. On the west coast, looking at mainly sunny skies in the morning, increasing cloud in the afternoon, 24 for a high in Victoria. Looking at 50K winds in the Juan de Fuca Strait, though, 27 for a high in Vancouver. The further inland Newfoundland you're going, it's going to be more like 29 degrees. In Edmonton, we're looking at local smoke, sunshine, and then increasing cloud, 27 for a high. 29 for a high in Calgary. Now, Calgary also under that heat warning. They're looking at least 29 for a high into next week as well. And tomorrow, Saturday, they're looking at 60% chance of showers with a risk of thunderstorms. So that's what's happening for our friends in Calgary. As we get into Saskatchewan, Saskatoon, looking at hazy conditions, but a 40% chance of showers, risk of a thunderstorm, 28 for a high there. Regina, mainly clear skies, high of 31 and a high of 29. In Winnipeg, with sunny and hazy conditions as well. As we get into central Canada here, let's look at Toronto. We're seeing a high of 25 degrees with a mix of sun and cloud. Partly cloudy skies also expected in Ottawa on Saturday with a high of 24, and Montreal's high 24 with a 30% chance of some showers there. As we get to the East Coast, we're seeing lots of precipitation, 2 millimeters expected of rain in Fredericton with a high of 23. Could see the possibility of some thunder showers there as well. Now, Halifax, looking at a rainfall warning, possibly looking at 25 to 30 millimeters of rain with some thunder showers, and also on the central coast, the Atlantic coast rather of the mainland of Nova Scotia, looking at 50 to 90 millimeters of rain. So lots of rainfall happening there. High of 22 in Halifax, 23 also expected in Charlottetown. Charlottetown looking at 15 to 30 millimeters as well. So lots of rainfall there. St. John's, though, looking at 40% chance of showers or drizzle, high of 25 and a 40K wind there. So there you have it. That is your forecast.
Stats Canada says our country's retail sales rose by 0.2% in May to $66 billion. The agency says gains at grocery stores and new car dealers led the way. Despite the gain, however, the figure fell short of an early estimate for May that predicted a gain of 0.5%. Its early estimate for June suggests retail sales for that month were unchanged, but cautions the figure will be revised. NFL owners have approved the sale of the Washington Commanders from Dan Snyder to a group led by Josh Harris, including NBA legend Magic Johnson, for a record $6.05 billion. Harris says his group is humbled and awed by the level of responsibility to win championships and excite the fans once again. The last time that Washington won the Super Bowl was in 1992 versus the Buffalo Bills. The purchase is the highest price paid for a North American professional sports club. Wow. AMC has ditched plans to charge more for seats with better sightlines 5 months after launching a pilot program. The movie theater chain's plan fell flat after competitors did not follow along with the plan, which was launched in only 3 American markets. AMC charged a little more for the seats and less for those in the front with inferior views. The company says it is ending the program in the coming weeks with no attempt to roll out the changes because it wants its pricing to remain competitive. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was up 110 points on the day to finish at 20,547. The Dow was up 2 points to 35,227. The S&P 500 was up 1 on the day to 4536, and the Nasdaq was down 30 points to 14,032. West Texas Intermediate Oil was up $1.42 to 77.07 US per barrel. Natural gas was down 4 cents to 2.71 US. Gold was down $7.59 on the day to 1961.94 US an ounce, and silver was down 15 cents to 24.61 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $11.59 per bushel, barley's at $9.38, canola's at $18.84, and corn is at $10.46 per bushel. Live cattle were down 30 cents to $1.80.03. Feeder cattle were up 83 cents to $245.93, and lean hogs were up a nickel to $100.68. The Canadian dollar was down slightly over the past 24 hours to 75.63 US. Recapping one of our top stories, Lethbridge police say their investigation into a body that was located at a Lethbridge McDonald's has shown no evidence that foul play was committed. On July 14th, police got a call from staff at the restaurant along University Drive that a body was found inside of a burned-out storage shed. The shed was previously damaged by a fire on July the 3rd. Police say the identity of the man will not be released. Is there a real hunger for more autonomy for Alberta, especially with the Trudeau government looking at transitioning away from our oil and gas sector? Josh Andrus, the Executive Director with Project Confederation, thinks so and shares the details shortly with BCN's Naveen Day. Listen, if you see news happening in your community, be sure to send us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. We'd love to hear from you.
Even with summer in full swing, the politics of Alberta and Canada continue to march on. There have been a lot of developments recently with Canadian censorship and the Liberal government wanting to keep their coalition alive as well. Then there's the ideology of the current federal Liberals and the reaction from the business world and Canadians themselves. To talk more about Alberta and the nation of Canada, we are joined by Josh Andrus. He is the Executive Director of Project Confederation. Josh, it's great to have you back.
Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to this.
Now, thinking of the recent Sustainable Jobs Bill, or Just Transition as it was previously called, do you see any steps that the current Canadian government taking to address the concerns and grievances of Albertans regarding the province's role in the national economy?
To put it bluntly, no. I mean, this has been an issue since the federal Liberals were elected in 2015. They brought in a tanker ban, immediately banning all exports of oil effectively off the coast of northern BC. They've brought in the Impact Assessment Act, otherwise known as the No More Pipelines Law, which is actually more encompassing than that. It effectively gives the Liberals final veto power on major projects, not just on energy, but it could be a gravel pit in Stettler. This is being challenged in the Supreme Court by the Alberta government with 8 other provinces intervening on Alberta's behalf. The federal government has zero support from the provinces on this. The Sustainable Jobs Act is just another step in the direction of completely dismantling Western Canada's energy sector. There aren't policies coming in to limit the number of cars on Ontario freeways. There aren't policies coming in to limit the ability of some of these, like a Quebec concrete company, from polluting the St. Lawrence. They're bringing in legislation that's directly targeting Alberta and Saskatchewan, and I think it's specifically because we don't vote Liberal. The Sustainable Jobs Plan there was a leaked memo from a Blacklock's reporter obtained it from the internal government memo that said Alberta will lose 187,000 jobs if the federal government moves forward with the Sustainable Jobs Act. They've now renamed what was called the Just Transition. They can't even use the terminology because of the negative connotations that comes with economic development in even a developed country as Canada, where we bring in a policy that's effectively going to drive costs up. Not only are they bringing in these policies designed to attack our industries, they've also extended the equalization formula for an additional 5 years in a recent Ways and Means motion. It was a 400-page document. The equalization renewal was buried 198 pages in. It was barely noticed. It's one of those things where we're happy to contribute to the development of the rest of the country, but we need to be free to do it. And if we're not free to do it, then why are we helping? I think that's really the basis of the frustration here. So no, the federal government does not care. We had a referendum in Alberta to eliminate equalization from the Constitution, eliminate the principle of it from the Constitution. It was supposed to trigger some kind of a negotiation. Not only has the federal government ignored it, they have actually extended the formula for an additional 5 years without consultation from the provinces. Finance Minister Nate Horner was on record saying that this is unacceptable. So this is something that is going to be an overarching issue through the summer as we head into the legislative session in the fall. It's going to be very interesting to see how fast the Liberals move on the Sustainable Jobs Act, especially given the pushback from primarily Alberta and Saskatchewan.
Now, you mentioned equalization as well as the Sustainable Jobs Bill, and a lot of oil and gas revenues pay for a lot of needs that Canadians have. So, in your opinion, do you think that there's a plan or idea of how Canada can make up the revenue shortfall if Canadian oil and gas sector was deleted?
No, I think this is poorly thought out. I think this is going to lead to job losses across the country. I mean, the energy industry, you have to remember, is the industry that powers every other industry. Without affordable energy, we can't have economic development. We actually could see the economy move backwards. Energy, because of its influence in price mechanisms. I mean, every product that you use uses energy when it's being produced, when it's being built, when it's being transported, and then when it's on the shelf at your grocery store or the store it's purchased at needs electricity to run. So by increasing energy costs across the economy, it's going to increase prices. And if you see that combined with increasing unemployment, it's going to lead to a deep recession across the country. I don't think this is well thought out. I think this is absolutely terrible policy coming out of the federal government, but it's nothing new. We've seen this before. It's been going on for the past 7-8 years here since the Liberals were elected. So it's going to be something that we're keeping an eye on for sure. Right now, Alberta's economy is the strongest in the country. Our immigration is the strongest it's been since 1914. We've seen the population grow. So we're in a unique position where we currently are doing okay, but to see the federal government plan on bringing in policies that, according to internal government memos, are going to phase out 187,000 jobs. That's going to have a devastating impact across this province, and I think it's going to enhance an already simmering cauldron of Western alienation.
Now, we've talked about revenue, but also the workforce too would be impacted, because we need to remember that removing Canada's oil and gas industry will affect airline pilots and camp workers, cooks, bus drivers, mechanics, janitorial, maintenance staff. Like, the list just goes on and on and on. It seems endless that the ramifications of the Sustainable Jobs Bill will affect like every sector of the Canadian economy. So do you think the government has really thought this through?
No, I mean, obviously not. I mean, this is based on sound economic theory too. I mean, we're seeing aggressive policy pushes. Canada as a net contributor to as a contributor to CO2 conditions, we're a carbon sink. We've got lots of trees. Our energy industry is ethical. We're moving towards carbon capture technology, but they're pushing ahead before the technology's there to actually combat it. Not to mention, we're seeing other jurisdictions like China and India increase the amount of coal-fired plants. Like, to me, we've got a government that's acting ideologically without really analyzing the impacts that we have, that's doing something to be able to say it's doing something. And we haven't even seen how much of an impact it's going to have when you have two of the world's largest economies and populations bringing in coal-fired plants. Like, to me, it's short-sighted and foolish, and it's going to have devastating consequences for the Canadian economy.
Now, one of the frustrations that Albertans have is they feel that Ottawa is making decisions that benefit Ontario and Quebec, but definitely not Alberta. So what specific policy or constitutional changes does Project Confederation advocate for to enhance Alberta's influence and autonomy within Canada? And how do you envision these changes positively impacting the province and its residents?
Well, first of all, we need free trade across the country. I mean, that's something that is supposed to be enshrined in the Constitution. Section 121 reads, and I don't have it in front of me, so I'm paraphrasing, but it effectively gives each province the ability to trade freely with another province. However, we've seen an activist Supreme Court, which is a common story throughout Canada's history, effectively rule against that, where they're giving the provinces the ability to block trade. We'd like to see clarification on the constitutional clause that gives free trade. I mean, do we have free trade or do we not? A second one is the ending of the equalization program. We think that it needs to be abolished. We think that it creates almost a welfare trap in some of the have-not provinces where they're reliant on revenues from the rest of the country to stay afloat and don't incentivize economic activity. Like a fishery or something like that off the coast of maybe Newfoundland, or an oil refinery somewhere in Eastern Canada, right? Like, so we're at the point where these are two absolutely awful policies that they're contributing to economic, weakness across the country. Not to mention, we have, for example, employment insurance. Alberta, through the 2015 to 2020 recession, give or take a year, we contributed every single year, even though our unemployment rates were the highest in the country. We are still a net contributor to unemployment. So that needs to be changed. We need to opt out of certain federal programs in exchange for tax points. I think the Alberta government could do a really good job of providing some of the services that are constitutionally in our jurisdiction, but are being run by the federal government based on conditional transfers. So if we opt out of the conditional transfers and get tax points instead, it gives our tax base the ability to provincially raise the revenue here and provide the services, which I think we can do better at a local level than the federal government can.
And collaboration and partnerships between provinces are crucial for Canada's success. So how does Project Confederation envision leveraging interprovincial relationships and fostering cooperation between Alberta and other provinces to address common challenges and achieve our shared objectives?
Well, it's interesting because as the federal government has centralized political control, we've seen provinces push back. We've seen provinces push back. Like right now, we're seeing it with in the Maritimes, for example. Atlantic Canada is standing up to the climate agenda because, again, it is about their ability to raise revenues internally. It is about their ability to provide good economic conditions for investors and job creators so that they can build the economy. We're seeing BC start to push back against certain areas in healthcare, right? Ontario has almost liberalized the use of the notwithstanding clause against the Prime Minister's wishes. So what you're seeing is pushback from provinces across the country, and you're starting to see collaboration at premiers meetings. There was one earlier this month late last month where Premier Danielle Smith met with all the other premiers, and there does seem to be a great degree of interest in collaboration. I think that's a great starting point to start to have the discussions that we need around how this country works, because the federal government is not only doing a bad job of delivering policy, but it's also centralizing control and taking away jurisdictional control from the provinces. And I think that's an issue that most provinces are starting to realize is something they're not just going to have to keep an eye on, but they're going to have to get actual changes for.
And do you feel that there are specific strategies that will be effective in garnering public support and promoting constructive dialogue on Alberta's role within Canada?
I think the government's done a good job of advocating on behalf of what Canada wants. And I do think that part of the reason that our migration patterns over the last year are so extensively in Alberta's favor, where we're seeing inflows from other provinces, is that the government's done a good job of actively building an economy that creates jobs. I think that's something that other provinces are realizing as their people are leaving, that they should probably start to focus on. And I think that part of the issue is, like, I think that provinces are wanting to see more decentralization, that they want more control. And I think that's something that, if we're focused on collaboration, focusing on the idea of decentralized control and giving provinces more autonomy over their own jurisdiction is something that is catching on. I mean, it's always been something that Quebec wants. I mean, we've got an ally right there. Ontario is pushing back on federal centralization. The Maritimes are pushing back. I think decentralization and provincial autonomy over their own issues, over their own constitutional jurisdiction, is something that's going to be a uniting factor as we move forward, especially in the wake of the just transition and some other federal policies that are just going to drive costs up on consumers.
So Josh, you mentioned Quebec, and when you think of Quebecers and Albertans, you don't necessarily think of them being the best of friends. But tell me, Josh, what have you heard from Quebec on Alberta's increasing desire for autonomy? Are they supportive of it?
So I haven't seen any comments directly from the Quebec government, but I do know that François Legault has been pushing for a much more autonomous agenda in Quebec on cultural issues. I mean, Alberta is more of an economic focused kind of a push, but Quebec does have a unique culture. I don't think anybody's going to deny that. He did that because he wanted to kill off the Parti Québécois. Now, he failed to do so. The Parti Québécois won a handful of seats in the most recent Quebec general election and have been rattling the cages of Legault from inside the Quebec National Assembly. They refuse to swear allegiance to the king, which is constitutionally mandated in the Constitution. They've been pushing for more reforms. Now, I go to conferences across the country, and I do talk to people from Quebec, political activists from Quebec. And most of them come up to me and say, man, I love what you guys are doing in Alberta. Like, you guys are basically following the Quebec agenda. They call it sovereignty association. They want to be a part of the country, but they also want sovereign control over their own constitutional jurisdiction, which is exactly what Alberta is pushing for. And I think you're going to start to see that that narrative tie the two provinces together, especially if we get to a constitutional negotiation where we do want to see certain powers that the federal government have passed back to the provinces. Employment insurance, like I mentioned earlier, is an area that Quebec has been pushing for. They even went so far as to create their own parental leave agency where they, with an agreement with the federal government, have control over parental leave in the province. So that's an idea that Alberta is potentially exploring, where we do have a lot of overlap in our policy agendas. And it's very interesting. Yeah, there is some frustration in Alberta towards Quebec, especially over equalization. But I think there's an appetite in Quebec to see equalization payments decrease in exchange for more autonomy over their own provinces, over their own affairs.
But all we've talked about today, it really does boil down to vision and leadership. So tell me, Josh, who do you think Canada's next Preston Manning is?
So I had to think about this. I don't think there's any single individual that is going to be the next Preston Manning. I think the power that we have now is that there's a lot of voices at the table. It's not just Danielle Smith. It's not just Scott Moe. You've got Doug Ford. You've even got Francois Legault talking about more provincial autonomy. You've got a very, like, it's coming from everywhere. And I think the more voices that we have on this issue, the better. I also think that part of the reason that we didn't succeed with reform in getting some of the changes we needed is because we tried to build it in a political party, a federal political party, and the provinces weren't really engaged in that. And I think that led to some issues. So I think that the approach that we're taking by having it come from the provinces is really the key here. If we focus on it, trying to change things within the federal Conservative Party or within a reform, or creating a reform party, I think that creates issues where you almost end up with a Liberal government for longer. I think pushing back from the provinces, especially when the federal government does have such a strong centralization ideology, really. I mean, they want control. I think that's really where the change is going to be. So, like I said, I don't know if anybody's going to be the next Preston Manning, but I think that the strength that we have now is in our numbers. And as our numbers grow, we're going to get much more pressure on the federal government, pressure on the constitutional structure of the country. And if we get that, we can actually sit down and have a strong discussion about what changes we want.
Well, Josh, that's all the time we have for today, but thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. That was great.
Land might be the only thing in the world that we can't make more of, and as a result, stewardship of the land is something that's been happening since the beginning of time. So who better to steward the land here in Canada than those who work on the land every day as part of their farming and ranching activities? So to talk more about land stewardship in Alberta, we're bringing in Justin Thompson, the Executive Director of Southern Alberta Land Trust, or SALTS, as it's known. Justin, welcome to Bridge City News.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, absolutely. So Justin, for those who may not have heard of SALTS here in Alberta, can you maybe give us a brief overview of how your organization cares for the rural and wild lands of Alberta?
Sure. So SALTS is a land trust organization, and we're a bit unique because, as you mentioned, our organization was started by ranchers in Southern Alberta, and our board of directors is still primarily made up of folks who ranch on a full-time basis. And so our focus is really to work with landowners to conserve those private lands in Southern Alberta that are of high ecological value. So wildlife habitat, important watershed areas. And so we do that through a tool called a conservation easement, which has been used now for, I guess, about 25 years in Alberta. And it essentially, in partnership with the landowner, if the landowner wants to see their land conserved, the easement basically puts a set of restrictions on the land that limit certain types of development. So, subdivision, new roads, cultivation, for example, of native grasslands, but really continues to support and encourage land uses like ranching that keep the land intact and support those values like wildlife habitat, like healthy watersheds, and also help to essentially keep the land in agriculture.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you support them, but maybe can you talk about the relationship between SALTS and the farmers and ranchers in Alberta?
Absolutely, yeah. So when we enter into a conservation easement and the landowner decides they want to see their land protected, it's a long-term relationship. The land is protected in perpetuity, but we also work with the landowners. Our landowners typically are already very good stewards. So they're already really interested in maintaining things like range health, riparian health. But we also try to bring extra value to the landowner where we can bring dollars for off-stream watering, fencing projects that help manage the grassland and the habitat. And so we're working with them on an ongoing basis. A lot of these landowners already know how to steward the land really well, but of course the economics of ranching is challenging. And so we try and bring some support to the table to help them do the absolutely best job of stewarding those lands. The big thing we do, though, is the front end. where these important properties that could be converted to a non-agricultural use, like subdivision and development, roads, whatever it might be, the big step is to keep those lands from becoming more fragmented. And so in the case, for example, for Lethbridge specifically, SALTS has done conservation projects with landowners covering about 35,000 acres in the Old Man watershed, which is about, I think, about 140 square kilometers of land, and that's all upstream of Lethbridge. And a lot of those projects are along rivers like the Old Man or the Crow's Nest, which means those lands are going to keep helping to provide services like clean water, flood mitigation, because when we convert these landscapes to things like houses and roads, of course, the water comes off more quickly, comes off dirtier. And so we're really trying to maintain things like water quality upstream.
Yeah. Okay. So you gave me some numbers there with some areas around the Old Man watershed and near Lethbridge. Maybe can you give us an idea of the amount of land that's being conserved with salts overall?
Yeah. So actually, because so much of SALT's work is from sort of west of Calgary down to Waterton Lakes National Park, most of our conservation easements are in the Old Man watershed. So again, about 35,000 acres of the land that we've protected is in the Old Man watershed. We've done probably another 10,000 acres outside. But really, that's why I'm excited to talk to you, is that so much of our work really is protecting lands that are of really high value for water and also recreation. If you like fishing, if you like hunting, we're protecting lands that are maintaining those resources, west of Lethbridge. If you start to look at what other land trusts, so there's SALTS, there's organizations like Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, there's other regional land trusts. There's been hundreds of thousands of acres conserved in the Old Man watershed, upstream of Lethbridge. And that is going to be really valuable in the long term to maintaining things like water quality and quantity downstream for the irrigation districts too, right? If we can keep those lands intact so they're providing better water flow throughout seasons and those sorts of things. So a lot of work being done. And I think, we don't do a lot of communications to folks in cities, but a lot of the work that we're doing is really having a direct benefit for cities, even though we're working in these rural areas.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, so how do you see the mission of SALTS that impacts Albertans and I suppose visitors even to the province as well?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, even though we're really focused on, how do you maintain healthy grasslands and riparian areas and watersheds, if you start to think of what that means, for example, we've protected a bunch of land along the Cowboy Trail, which means, that's one of the most beautiful highways in my mind anywhere in the world. And it's a real tourism draw. People go down that highway and they're like, isn't this amazing? This big open country, open spaces, no development. So by keeping that as open space, there's tourism value there. Land trusts like SALTS have protected a huge amount of, for example, winter range for deer and elk and moose. So if you're interested as a hunter, we're helping to protect that resource. We've conserved kilometers of land on either sides of rivers like the Castle, the Old Man, and the Crow's Nest. So if you like fishing, it's preserving those resources. So there's recreation, there's tourism, there's aesthetic resources that are all being conserved on private land that are benefiting Albertans really broadly.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's an education component to SALTS. So maybe what can you tell us about it?
Yeah, I think our biggest effort on the education side is helping people to understand the value of these private lands in Alberta. I think a lot of people think, well, we have our parks, right? We've got our parks in the mountains, and so we've got it all done. But there's a lot of private land outside of parks that we rely on for things like freshwater and wildlife. And so that's our biggest push from an education standpoint, especially in talking to people that live in urban centers, to just help them understand just how valuable these landscapes are. And the other thing we like to help people understand is that, ranching and grazing on our grasslands and foothills is probably the most compatible land use. Those landscapes evolved with grazing by bison, and they actually require grazing in order to maintain biodiversity and the health of the soil. And so a lot of people, I think, have concerns, but don't realize that, in fact, having ranching on those landscapes is probably the most compatible land use if you want to maintain things like water quality. and wildlife habitat. So that's another big education piece here, is that, if we remove grazing from that landscape in the foothills and the grasslands, it would actually have a negative effect on a lot of these things that we value.
Wow. So in your mind, Justin, it's important for landowners to participate in the mission of SALT, obviously. Are there risks, though, or downside? Is there a downside for landowners who participate with the land trust?
We do not get involved in the day-to-day management of the land. So really, we're very hands-off. The landowner can continue to manage the land. The land can be transferred to their family. It can be sold. We have no say in that. It's if the landowner's values align with our values, then it's a really good fit. And another big factor here is that salts, when we do these conservation easements, can bring some really important financial incentives to the landowner, because the landowner is giving up some development rights when they do these easements. And so in return, we can compensate them for that. And we can do that often through a combination of a charitable receipt and some cash payment. And those charitable receipts can often be really helpful to ranchers and landowners who are dealing with the transfer of their land, for example, the next generation. So we can facilitate often the transfer of land between generations and help to avoid big capital gains tax that might otherwise mean they'd have to sell parts of the ranch during that transfer. So, there's the conservation value if the landowners are aligned, and so if there's alignment there, no downsides. We're not involved in the management, and there's also this financial opportunity that can really help families if they're trying to make sure they can continue to ranch.
Interesting. Okay, so Justin, looking ahead a couple of decades, how big of a role does we were talking about Southern Alberta, Lethbridge, how big of a role does the Highway 2 corridor between Lethbridge and Calgary play in the future targets for land stewardship?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the Highway 2 corridor, has a really interesting mix. Certainly along the east side of the corridor, there's a lot of cultivated land, but there's also some pockets of really important grassland habitat. But west of Highway 2, all along the Porcupine Hills, that is actually to the west of Highway 2, on the east side of the Porcupine Hills, that is one of the biggest remaining blocks of grassland in southern Alberta. It's one of those places that has not been converted to other land uses. And so that's a really important area for us to try and see, both from a wildlife standpoint, but also from a watershed, right? Because so many of our creeks and rivers flow off those foothills. And so keeping those foothills intact is really key. And so really we're trying to make sure, land conservation will never protect all the land, and we can't, and we don't intend to, but we're really trying to focus in on those areas of the province that have the highest ecological value, but also going to benefit Albertans long-term down the road in terms of protecting our water and our wildlife resources and our tourism resources. So the Highway 2 corridor is really key. Like I said, west of Highway 2, there's some really, really important land. And then there's also some areas just east of Highway 2, there's pockets of grasslands that are really valuable habitat, especially along our rivers. If we can keep some of that land next to our rivers in sort of a more natural state, it's important. There's so much wildlife, of course, that we know that congregates on rivers. It helps the water quality in the river if there's natural landscapes on either side. There are wildlife corridors up and down rivers, so it's a very important area.
Are there any number of bears or other predatory animals? Are they increasing, to your knowledge?
Yeah, that's a really big, complex question. We have, for a number of years, we've seen a lot more, I think, predators on private lands. We've got a lot of black bears and grizzly bears and cougars in the foothills of Alberta, and they're also moving along those corridors, the river corridors. And so that's been something that ranchers are having to manage. I think there's been more and more effective tools on how we coexist with those predators. And there's been a lot of good work done on how we coexist with those predators, because in the past we would just get rid of them. But I think now we're moving towards a new relationship with a lot of those predators, and I think for the most part the ranching industry is trying to find a balance to coexist.
Oh, that's fantastic. And of course, here in the southwest corner of Alberta, something also that you see a lot is logging, oil, gas, mining operations in the area. So do you see an increasing relationship between stewarding the land and resource use?
It's a good question. I mean, more of the proposals for logging and mining are happening on public lands. And of course, with salts, we're just working on private lands. Conservation easements, if there's existing oil and gas or there's mineral rights holders, conservation easements don't, stop the mineral rights holder necessarily. We try and work with the landowner. And if there's proposals for oil and gas, for example, we try and work with the landowner and the proponent to really minimize the impact to the property from an ecological standpoint. It's not a big part of what we're seeing. We're not seeing a lot of new mineral development like oil and gas, and certainly not forestry or mining on our properties that we work with landowners. It's not a huge factor. I think it is interesting though to talk about the interplay between the private land and the crown land next door, because we have these proposals sometimes on crown land, but then of course what happens to water and wildlife on crown land will affect the private land right downstream or right next door. And so where we're working to conserve private land up and down the foothills, we do want to make sure that's what's happening next door on the public land is making sure that both are complementing each other. So they're related, but we're not seeing that doesn't affect us directly.
Justin, it looks like we're about out of time, but thanks so much for joining us today. I appreciate having you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Justin Thompson is the Executive Director of the Southern Alberta Land Trust. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for watching.